Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen, that drive them, and their effects. My name is Brady Podlowski, and I am your host. Today, we are talking about sinkholes in rural Turkey. And the interesting component of today's discussion and events is that recent media depiction of sinkholes in central Turkey, or Turkey, overall have really shown that these are really recent, but a lot of evidence actually suggests that it's not recent at all, and they've been happening for a while for the same reason. We're going to dig into that. So with that, the intent of exploring today's event and ongoing events is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who are facing this difficult series of events and other disasters, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why they happen the way they do. Ask why disasters happen. And with that, let's begin. Welcome in. Today, sinkholes and drought and human mismanagement of fresh water, which is basically the topic of what we're getting into. I'm going to first of all state that this is the audio only version. So if you're watching on YouTube, you're just getting the audio. You can also go to Apple Podcast. I've also had the request to put these on Spotify. I will make my way to Spotify as soon as I can. But with that, we're just looking at the audio podcast form, I guess you could call it, of today. We are talking about Turkey, or Turkey, and I'm just going to keep on calling it Turkey because that is now the official name. And we are talking about central Turkey, where the region, particularly the Konya region, and if you know anything about basically the geography of Turkey, Konya is in the center or central part. If we talk about previous episodes, the Kahramanmaraş earthquakes were in the east. Well, this series of sinkholes is in the west. And interestingly, and just some background before we actually get into today's topic, the region we're talking about is the agricultural hub of Turkey. It produces food, but it also produces cash crops. And those are really the discussions where we have to get into when we discuss farming in Turkey. With that, we are talking about sinkholes. So predominantly, and just background, sinkholes are basically caused with a void of space underneath the ground where something is not under the ground supporting it. And basically there's a void of any sort of space, whether it's because of water or ground, shifts in ground, anything. And that can produce sinkholes. The other component to acknowledge in this that I will not discuss after this is that our Earth is drastically moving extremely slowly. All the tectonic plates underneath the ground, including in the ocean, are shifting the Earth itself. I think that is meriting, a little bit of that discussion. But today's topic is really, why are sinkholes happening in rural Turkey? Part of it has to do with drought, but the other part of it has to do with the amount of water we are using and what's called water bankruptcy. So today we're going to talk about why sinkholes are happening, drought, different kinds of drought, very interesting, and then the human management side to all of this. So with that, to begin, basically, what is happening? Why are sinkholes happening? Well, over the Konya region, central Turkey, there has been a significant amount of reported sinkholes. Different reports suggest over 700 large sinkholes. The diameter, basically ranges, but the depth is very, very deep. So there's sort of a hazard in terms of the overall, number one, the amount of sinkholes that's happening. 700 is a lot. But the depth, if the depth is a very important consideration. If somebody were to fall or if somebody were to lose something in there, there could be pretty significant health implications. The really interesting and critical component of sinkholes in this part of the Konya Basin or Konya itself is actually the economic impact. Basically, sinkholes are happening to the agricultural land where farming is happening. There is a critical and a massive economic side to this, where basically the land is unusable after the sinkhole occurs. And also it becomes, again, that health impact, that potential for, a safety concern, where if you're basically in a combine or a tractor or you're doing any sort of farming that requires you to go, nearby a possible place where there could be a sinkhole, and there's that void of basically collapsed area, there could be, the risk of death and everything. So overall in central Turkey, sinkholes are happening, and they have been happening as of 1970. So this is not the first time that they really have occurred. I think in 2025, as of the day of recording, Wednesday, December 24th, the perception by the media is really anything that has to do with climate change, which we will definitely talk about, and drought kind of gets more picked up than maybe it did before. But what we know is upwards more than 700 sinkholes across agricultural land, and that is influencing, harming farmers in the sense of, well, they have less space to actually farm, but also the long-term impacts in the sense of you probably are not ever getting that land back. Additionally, there's also the pressure of just agricultural in general. So in central Konya region of Turkey, we note that the predominant crops are corn, sugar beets, and wheat. And for the purposes of simplicity, I'm going to call corn and sugar beets for Turkey cash crops. And part of the reason is because those two crops actually tend to be more water intensive. So they require a bit more water than others, and maybe others that are more natural to the region. Okay, so 700 sinkholes, risk of health, economic implications. For the farmers themselves, there's a pressure. Overall, what climate change has done for farmers around the world is produce the situation where it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to be sure what you can grow because the weather is becoming so much more weird. And if you've heard me talk about climate change before, you might have heard me reference Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who really frames climate change nicely. She talks about climate change in a way of it is creating weirder patterns. We don't know. We really have less ability to predict what's coming. We don't know the type of rainfall, the type of absence of rainfall, drought and everything. And this is really producing a lot of problems for all of us. And with that, central Turkey has actually seen a reduction of rainfall over the last however many years. I'll call it the last 15 years as of one report. And drought has really driven a lot of sinkholes. But let's actually dive into drought itself, because I actually think this is really interesting. There's a few great articles, one specifically on the Konya Basin that I've drawn a lot of this material from. And this author actually classifies drought into one of four categories: hydrological, meteorological, agricultural, and socioeconomic drought. So all four of those are four different kinds of drought, or four different reasons why drought will occur. So quickly covering each one of them. What is meteorological drought? Meteorological drought is basically the lack of precipitation. Not enough rainfall, drought. Or if your ecosystems are used to basically having rainfall to restore basically the ecosystems like the rivers, the valleys, basins, whatever, but also the underground aquifers. And so that's an important consideration. That's meteorological drought. Precipitation, basically lack of rain. Hydrological drought gets into a little bit of an interesting one, and it kind of shares a little bit of meteorological. So these can be interrelated, but I love this classification of one of the four, and it can cascade into one of the next. What is hydrological drought? Well, hydrological drought is water scarcity in streams, rivers, in groundwater, and then in total water shortage. So, quickly just stopping to talk about the difference between meteorological, hydrological. Well, this report that I've pulled information from really notes that over the last decades, severity, duration, intensity of meteorological droughts are of great importance. And it's largely because it's rainfall produced drought. Whereas when we look at hydrological droughts, they're usually determined by river basin, how wide the river is, the scale, and how much water we actually have nearby or stored underground in aquifers that we will, use by digging up wells and whatnot. So that's kind of those first two, those hydrological, meteorological. The next one is what's called agricultural drought. And Dr. Heathcote in 1988 wrote about it and suggests the definition for agricultural drought is a lack of water damaging human agricultural activities. It results from a combination of agricultural activities, a lot of demand for water, versus natural phenomena, so the amount of water available, supply, which can lead to insufficient water volumes to plant or for animal needs. And I think this is really interesting. So basically, we have three different kinds of droughts. We'll get into the fourth. And they all can produce drought for their own reason. Lack of precipitation for meteorological. Hydrological is basically water scarcity in the stream or underground or just total water shortage. Those can be definitely intertwined. Agriculture is basically saying we don't have enough water to farm. Then agricultural actually links nicely with socioeconomic, which is characterized by available fresh water for people to drink, but also potable water to use. So the quality, the water quality is really the thing talked about for socioeconomic drought. And when we think about all four of those, I think that first of all, that does it's a nice way to think about drought. It's not just one simple drought, that's produced by a lack of rainfall. Well, that's meteorological. And so the more detailed we can get, the better we can understand why these sorts of things are happening. And really, that will tie us into, what's going on in central Turkey? What sort of drought are we going through? It's really interesting. It's not just one. But anyways, digress before we get into it quickly. Fresh water is crucial for lots of our ecosystems. There's a few statistics out there. I think of the total water on Earth, only 3% of it is fresh water. And of that 3%, only 0.5% of that 3% is actually fresh water that's drinkable. So meaning we can actually use it. So it has to be treated before we can actually use it. Or warmed up, heated. So it's the idea of you can't actually go to a glacier water and drink that water and not expect to have some bacteria because might be something there. So overall, water, fresh water, and the first theme I really want to relay is that fresh water is not a limitless resource. It's finite. And I think part of our human value, part of the way I certainly grew up, is water is always limitless. You can always get more. You can always get more fresh water. Or there will be some technology that can create clean and fresh water. And this not only relates to that socioeconomic side of you live in a city, you're going to have fresh water. You're going to have access to clean fresh water. But one of the values we have as humans, I think, is that we, again, oversimplify this narrative that fresh water is always going to be there. But we are seeing, as climate change produces the situation where meteorological drought could occur, hydrological drought could occur, there's not as much precipitation in some areas, whereas others there's much more. We are seeing a change in the conditions, and we are seeing perhaps a shift in water, fresh water availability. So that's just the first theme. Let's get into it. What is happening central Turkey? Well, let's talk about first the climate change element. So overall, pulled another article that I think does really nice justice to climate change, central Turkey, Konya region. Well, what's happening there is we are seeing increases in water scarcity and in hydrological and meteorological droughts. Good thing we know those two terms now. The implication is that Konya has what's called a closed basin, or an underground reservoir of water, of groundwater. And over the last 20 to however many years, there's been great reductions in the amount of fresh water that goes into the underground aquifers. Part of this is because the amount that is being pulled out, but also the amount that's going in. And the changes in the climate are influencing that. And in central Konya, basically climate change is kind of increasing the pressure on these water systems. They are no longer as, I don't want to say consistent, but there's definitely changes in those patterns. That's a really important note. But next, when we think about climate change in central Konya, basically there's less rainfall, or there's less consistent rainfall. And in the last 15 years, we note that there's been prolonged and severe droughts, where reservoirs in central Konya and aquifer levels, so reservoirs are basically human-made, where we're storing water, where we can use it, potable water, for some of the very large cities around in Konya region. And then the aquifer levels are underground. And as of 2021, they reached their 15-year low. So drought can be not only just like 1 or 2 years, it can be like decades long sometimes. And in central Turkey, we are seeing extreme levels of drought, or severe levels, I'll say, not extreme, where basically it's forcing basically a shift in how we have to manage and think about our water. It is no longer the limitless resource that maybe we've all come to expect. And just a final note, groundwater levels in the region have dropped 4 to 5 meters over the last 2 decades. When we compare, there's another stat I'll pull out. Before 2 decades ago, so before 2005, water levels dropped 0.5 meters a year, whereas each year for the last 20 years, they've dropped 4 to 5 liters, or 4 to 5 meters, sorry, jeez. Why? Well, this kind of gets into the human side of this. Well, number one, there is increase in the number of wells that are used for human consumption, but then also farming. Unplanned land use planning, and that kind of speaks to the wells, but then also increased human consumption of water. So let's just tackle all three quickly. Number one, the amount of farming wells, and this number is not confirmed. I'm not able to find a secondary source to confirm these numbers, but basically over the last 20, 30 years, there's been more wells to pull water from for farming and just for general use. Supposedly there is upwards to 120,000 unlicensed wells and 40,000 licensed wells which pull water from the underground. So over the last 30 years, development-wise, we've built more extraction of taking out water from the ground. And then we are obviously seeing the result of that. Instead of 0.5 meters per year, it's 4 to 5 meters because we're overusing water. The difficulty is that overuse of water has actually created large voids in space. And that is leading to sinkholes. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the type of crops, and I kind of already talked about this. The cash crops, the corn and sugar beets, are really water intense. So hopefully you're starting to get a larger picture that we are growing crops that reduce or that require a lot of water, and then we're overusing the water that we have in the region. And what that's doing is it's basically the earth is reacting now. It's basically saying that, well, there is an overdependence for groundwater to grow these crops because maybe they need to sustain economic viability as farmers. And to be fair, the last 20 years there has been inconsistent drought, or there has been severe drought for parts of the province. Parts of the Konya region. So farmers are probably stressed more than ever in terms of the economic viability. They might have to grow corn and sugar beets because that's the only economic way to stay afloat, to actually keep farming. So kind of trapped in this cycle of, I have to farm these cash crops or else I can't make a livelihood and I can't feed my family. And then I'll have to go. And eventually all the costs continue. But at the same time, those require a lot of water. And sometimes, whether it's the unlicensed wells or the licensed wells, where you need to have more water to be able to grow these cash crops. And overall, overdependence on groundwater has forced lots of voids in space where sinkholes are occurring. And they are disproportionately occurring in farming land. And I think there's the 1-to-1 where we're actually seeing that. So plain language, let me just simplify. So sinkholes are occurring in central Turkey. One, because of climate change, certainly that element of there's limited precipitation, there's less rainfall. But then there's also an over extraction of water. That's the human management side of it, which is producing the conditions where voids of space underground are occurring and sinkholes occur. And it's being produced by whether it's the economic need to, they have to sustain livelihoods for farmers. They're looking for the cash crop ones, the sugar beets and whatnot. And I think just to add just a few more points before I wrap up, but in the last 50 years, Konya region has seen some significant droughts. And I did find another report suggesting that, well, one of the worst droughts that this region had was actually from October 2024 to August 2025, where rainfall, and quickly, meteorological and hydrological droughts are not just produced by no water. Sometimes it's less water or less than average rainfall amounts. And that's a key consideration. From October 2024 to August 2025, rainfall was 27% below the average. And in other parts of Turkey, there was declines in rainfall as well. So what that does is it stresses the reservoirs all around Turkey. And then whether governments or farmers, cities are forced to borrow water from other regions. And that is what further hamstrings or hinders, water management for the reservoirs. So we have our own reservoirs that we're basically, producing or holding, making sure that water can be used from there. But then when those reservoirs are done, we're also using that reservoir. We're also using the groundwater as well. And the wells, the heavy extraction is also doing that. And when we think about just high level and kind of this idea of human values and basically over extraction of what we think is a limitless resource, I think this is one of the events, almost not like a milestone, but it's certainly another point of emphasis where groundwater, fresh water, is a resource that we need to be more thoughtful about than ever before. and our economic cycles that produce dependency for farmers to have to, grow cash crops is really a giant catalyst and cause for all of this. And I think, again, it is a human value for us to consider that, the overuse and overconsumption of water for different kinds of crops as a means of staying afloat as a farmer. So that is really hopefully one of the key takeaways that you hopefully can take away from this. A little bit of a shorter episode. I mean, 25 minutes is not short, but by my standards, I'm feeling pretty good about that. So with that, Sinkholes will continue in Türkiye. And really, there is not a lot of overarching government protocols or things that I've seen, or basically responses or actions, largely because this is a systematic issue. This is a slow onset disaster where we see smaller disasters really unfold, small sinkholes, which are intensified by drought or caused by drought. And with that is all I got for today. If you are interested in any other disasters or you want me to talk about a disaster, feel free to reach out to me. I am more active on social media now than I've ever been before. So I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. If you ever have a question about how something happens or things like that, do my best to research it and acknowledge where I don't know the answer. And I'll try to bring on an expert who does have the answer. And with that is all I got for today. If you can leave me a review on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, I'd greatly appreciate it. And the next episode, I'm hoping to have a guest come on and talk about some of the hazards we have high in the mountains in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. But we'll see. Not to tease too much. So with that, thank you for listening and joining. Later.